Okay, so in this next section of our conference, we really wanted to hear from non-psyche professionals and hear from other people about their experiences of leadership in this field. And so we're delighted to welcome Maia Kutner, who is part of Leadership by City Governments. And she's head of what was called the Carbon Disclosure Project. And she has a lot of experience in corporate environmental reporting, politics, and social entrepreneurship. And in 2009, she completed an MSc in environmental policy at the LSE here in London. So, over to you, Maia.
Thank you. Hi everyone, it's nice to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak and for all the talks this morning, which were very interesting. I think one of the things I like about working in the environmental fields is that you get to meet people from all different backgrounds. I work with, kind of engineers, business people, policy people, and of course getting the perspective from psychologists is very, very, very relevant and interesting too. So thank you for the introduction. As mentioned, I run CDP's Cities program, but have been at CDP for a while. I previously worked with companies on climate change, so today I will talk to you about what I've learned through my work at CDP, working with both companies and cities on climate change, and why I think that right now cities are really an important part of addressing climate change. So first of all, a little bit about CDP, previously the Carbon Disclosure Project. So CDP is a not-for-profit organization. It was founded about 15 years ago in a time where awareness about climate change amongst institutions was very limited, not widely spread, and generally national governments weren't doing much, less than they are today for sure. So the idea was simple, but over time it proved to be quite effective. So the idea was that we can't manage what we don't measure, or in other words, if we start measuring our impact on climate change and the impact that companies have on climate change specifically, maybe we will start managing it too. So back then, 15 years ago, we created and started running a global disclosure system to get all the biggest companies in the world to measure and publicly disclose their climate change information. And by climate change information, we mean information on their greenhouse gas emissions, but also we have asked questions and continue to ask questions that really probe organizations to think beyond just carbon emissions about the impacts that climate change will have on their business, to kind of drive them to think about it and to act on it. So the question was, in the absence of regulation, how do we get all these big polluting companies to disclose and to do it publicly? So what we started doing is that we started sending letters to the CEOs of the companies on behalf of a group of institutional investors who we managed to convince to get on board, telling them about why climate change is an issue that is relevant to investment as well. And we started sending these letters and inviting the companies to disclose. So the question then was, how would this disclosure or this process actually, help us achieve our mission and help raise awareness to climate change? And the idea is that essentially through public disclosure, there's two processes that happen within the organization. The first one is a company, an organization for the first time gets this request to disclose. They start measuring and tracking their emissions. And with time, they improve. And in fact, we see that organizations that disclose information are more likely to have emission reduction targets, and they're more likely to reduce emissions too. But then the second process is what happens with the information that is then disclosed. So by sharing the information back with investors and with other essentially parties that can hold companies responsible, there is a process there of accountability. which has an impact too. So that's kind of the theory behind disclosure. But anyway, we fast forward 15 years to today, and today we have over 5,600 companies globally reporting their climate change information through CDP. We also expanded to cover water and deforestation issues, which are clearly linked to climate change. We represent over 900 institutional investors who are interested in climate change and on whose behalf we request this information. Today we also represent 75 of the world's largest purchasing organizations, so large companies that have big supply chains, and they engage with their supply chains through CDP. And today I think that there's a lot to be upset about with regards to climate change and to be pessimistic about. But I think when we look back in 2001, we encountered many confused companies that have not heard of climate change and didn't even know what an emission reduction target is. As we're today, thousands of organizations know what it is and are reporting on it. Hundreds of them are setting very ambitious targets, are aligned with science. Many of them are setting renewable energy targets. Some of them have committed to removing deforestation from their corporate supply chains. So really kind of a different world than it was back then. And one other really big change, which is very relevant to me, which happened since then, is that we quickly realized that it is not only CEOs that can make decisions that directly and significantly impact our lives and our climate. It's also mayors and governors, so local governments, cities, states, and regions are really important. So they have powers and they can make decisions, even in the absence of policy at national level, and they can often move quicker. So in 2010, we extended our disclosure work to cover subnational governments as well. And today, over 500 cities globally and almost 100 states and regions are disclosing their climate information through CDP. And by states, I mean US states, so still on the subnational level. So why do cities matter? I think the subject of my talk is climate leadership in cities. So just a bit of background. I'm not going to assume kind of any prior information on this, but cities are important because first of all, they're home to half of the world's population, and that's only going to grow. They're also the home of 3/4 of our global greenhouse gas emissions and energy use. So clearly, very, very important. Cities also have powers, importantly, to create change. So they can often act quicker than national governments, as I previously mentioned. So cities don't usually have powers over things like energy production. That tends to fall within the national government's realm of responsibility, but they do have powers on many, many areas that do influence emissions. For example, buildings, and planning, over transport, over waste policies. But they also have powers over areas that you wouldn't necessarily associate with cities initially, such as food. For example, how food is consumed, distributed, and disposed of in the city. And I think significantly, potentially to this crowd too, cities really can influence the hearts and minds of their citizens, which we know, especially in the current political environments, but generally is very, very important. They have a direct impact on the well-being and the health of people. Importantly, the decisions that cities take around how to build and design their transport systems, their buildings, really do have a significant impact on the emissions profile of the city into the future. So often decisions that are made are hard to reverse. An example would be the North American model of a city, which isn't very densely populated and more car-based. These things are really, really hard to change over time. And those cities do tend to be higher emitters and associated sometimes with less healthy populations. And the interesting thing about working with cities too is that they recognize the risk from climate change because they're often exposed to it very quickly and they're the first ones to experience it. but they also seek significant opportunities from addressing climate change. So from the 533 cities that disclosed to us, over 80% recognize climate change as a real risk to their city and the citizens and the businesses working within the city. But almost as many also see it as an opportunity. And here, what cities are telling us is that they're seeing it as an opportunity to develop new business industries, but also achieving co-benefits such as cleaner air, improved health, and greater well-being for citizens. So often within cities, action on climate change is associated with these co-benefits, which actually means that the story that we can tell can be a positive story. Cities recently also are recognizing that when they come together, they have a more powerful voice, especially in this day and age where national governments have been slow to act on climate change, despite the recent developments from the climate agreement, which have been positive. So this was very clear in the run-up to Paris, where many cities, alongside kind of other non-state actors, came together to make commitments and essentially try to push national governments to show them that climate action is happening and it's meaningful. So it's about time that we have an agreement that covers it across the national level too, the international level. And in fact, after Paris, we see this trend continuing. So I just got back from Marrakesh, from the climate agreement, from the climate conference there. And the voice of cities and to be honest, businesses and other actors who have been more involved in climate politics in fact the past few years is very clear and still present. So we have seen, for example, an increase of 70% in the number of cities that are disclosing their climate information through us in the past year following Paris. Equally, we've seen other initiatives in the city space. There was a recent merge between these two initiatives called the Compacted Mayors and the EU Covenant of Mayors to create the biggest coalition on cities committing to address climate change globally. So these things are definitely reassuring. Another thing that we see through CDP, which is a growing trend, is that collaboration between cities and other levels of government, but also with the private sector, is something that is really needed to address some of the challenges that we're facing with climate change. So, for example, cities are telling us that they want to collaborate with the private sector to develop new technologies and also create new jobs that are needed in cities. By collaborating with the private sector, cities are telling us that we can find innovative new ways to finance the change that we need to see in cities. So there's a lot of investment that is required in urban infrastructure to make it resilient and also to reduce emissions. And that money can't come alone from the public sector. So collaborations with the private sector can facilitate that change. And I think very significantly, and I think this will resonate to many of you in the room, it's important for cities to address the issue, both alone and with the private sectors, of ensuring that any transition that we see towards a low-carbon future is a just one for their citizens and for all people. I think recent political developments just brought this specific point to the forefront of many of those of us working in this space for a long time. And I think many of you might be surprised that, that it's not something trivial, that we don't think about immediately, this idea of, change will impact people. People matter. But certainly recent political developments really, really put in the forefront of our minds of the fact that any change that we talk about in terms of changing our society in a radical way will have an impact on people, and we have to make sure that we are able to take that under consideration and ensure that that transition is just. And in this regard, cities working together with businesses within their city and thinking about things on how to, for example, retrain staff to a new skill set and making sure that people are able to deal with these changes is very, very important. So I'll conclude now. I think I have a couple of minutes left. So I think working in this field, there are always plenty of reasons to feel pessimistic or discouraged or upset, especially when you're dealing with such a big issue, which is so systemic. But coming back from the climate change conference in Marrakesh, I actually see many reasons to feel optimistic. I feel that the world has to some part woken up to the fact that we need to address climate change. Many countries have ratified the Paris Agreement within 12 months of signing it, which is great. There's a growing understanding that the transition that we're facing has to be a just one for citizens and for people. And even if we will see that some national governments are slowing down or potentially even reversing their policies, we see very encouraging leadership on the subnational level. We see ambitious cities, US states, and regions stepping up. And I think really today's CEOs, governors, and mayors are making decisions that will impact the world and our lives and our climate. But they're better placed to do so and to make the right decisions and to work together than before, which I find reassuring. Thank you.